We titled this webinar, The Decision Model, Linking Business and Technology. And the purpose of the webinar is to introduce this new model. It's a totally new model, and it is based on rigor similar to the rigor behind the relational model. And we've called it the decision model. We have developed it and tested it by both business people and technology people, which is very interesting. We're currently working with a group of underwriters and risk managers in addition to business analysts, and they are able to develop their own decision models, and some of the business people can critique them. They're very easy to understand and very simple to create as long as you understand the logic behind it. So the purpose of this webinar is to introduce you to the decision model and particularly how it fills part of the gap between business and IT. We've also passed some of the decision models on to IT groups who have found it very, very productive to implement the decision models in technology, particularly if they're using business rule management systems such as IBM's iLog or FICO's Blaze. So the decision model simplifies the capture and management of business rules, and we'll talk about business logic, precisely because they now have their own model. We're not going to bury this information in process models anymore or in use cases anymore because it doesn't belong there. And because of this separate model that's very rigorous and simple, the business rules and business logic become elevated to the status of something that's more important to the business. That's the most exciting part of the decision model. It really gains high management attention. So when you deliver decision models, they do attract this high-level management attention because they represent the core of business leadership and the way the business leaders can use it and want to make important decisions, whether those decisions are automated or not. So it's really an interesting transition, I think, in our industry, as Dr. Ofer suggests. So if we move on to the next page, why this webinar is important. And we have a slide here that talks about the relational model versus the decision model. And I was very fortunate to be able to work with the relational model when it first came out in 1970, or first was written about in 1970. I was lucky enough to be working with Chris State and Dr. Codd at that time through a client relationship. So let me talk about what I learned about the relational model and how we applied it to the decision model. The decision model is similar to the relational model in some very significant ways. So this webinar is important because of the lessons we learned from that experience with the relational model and the benefits that we still gain from it because it is a rigorous and universal model. So current experience with the decision model suggests that it may have the same impact on businesses today. On the left-hand side of this page, we recall that the relational model changed the way we manage, leverage, and store data. And it did that by recognizing that data has its own existence separate from process and program code, for example. And by recognizing this separate existence, data emerged as an important organizational asset that we could manage better. And we are able to manage it better because we can now deliver data in its most atomic and simple and manageable form. And the adoption of the relational model as a technology-independent model of data was really significant in bringing about the information revolution. What's important about the relational model is its scientific foundation and simplicity, and that's what changed the direction of technology, methodology, and best practices in the data world today. On the right-hand side of the page, we consider the decision model today as a similar model. We have found that it actually changes the way we view and manage business rules and business logic for exactly the same reasons. It recognizes that business logic and business thinking, whether automated or not, like data, has its own existence, which should be separate from process and program code and even separate from the data. So it becomes a tangible and important organizational asset that we can now manage better. And we can manage it better because the decision model includes the science of normalization principles and other principles as those principles are applied to logic instead of as applied to data. So the decision model in practice has already changed our own methodologies and best practices, and it produces deliverables faster and in smaller increments and fits very nicely with agile development projects. So we do expect new advances in technology to follow, just as they did after the relational model, and just as Dr. Ofer himself was suggesting might be coming. So here's the agenda for the remainder of the webinar. We start by understanding the state of decisions today in business, in addition to how we automate them today, and their influence on that performance of their businesses. And what's really interesting is just in the same month that our book came out, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review by Tom Davenport, and it was all about decision analysis and decision making. And this page discloses some of his observations that he made in that article of November 2009. He says that in recent years, decision makers in both the public and private sectors have made an astounding number of poor calls. And then he lists and explains the poor calls of the 4 companies that you see on this page. But the second bullet is also interesting. He says that decisions have been viewed as the prerogative of senior executives, meaning that decisions have not been the subject of systematic analysis as perhaps they ought to be. The third bullet is even more relevant to this webinar because he states that the whole process by which we make decisions, the way it uses information and creates information, and the logic by which it reaches conclusions are usually treated as a black box. And I think that's true whether it's a manual decision where executives get together, a human decision, or we put the decisions in program code in our transactions. We lose the logic. We don't really know sometimes how those decisions are being made in our systems today. So this is a little bit alarming. And if decision logic is a black box, we might ask, how well is it serving the business if it is virtually unknown or undocumented or hidden or mysterious and particularly resistant to change? And so today, we propose that the decision model takes the mystery out of this black box. We find business people walking around cafeterias with decision models on napkins and arguing over how different decisions, whether they're approving a mortgage or paying a claim in healthcare insurance, they talk about how the decisions are made and they argue over the criteria that's being used today. And they're able to do that because the decision model represents their criteria and how they make decisions, and they're able to critique it and argue about it. So on this page, Davenport goes on to say that today decision-making is becoming the focus of systematic analysis. That is, business leaders are now recognizing the importance of decision-making and are taking steps to make it tangible. And he explains success stories related to Chevron, ETS, and the Stanley Works. We at KPI, as I said, we have success stories in various mortgage companies and healthcare insurance companies, personal lines insurance, and we use the decision model to deliver successful decision-making, whether the decision is being made by humans behind closed doors or whether they are automated in systems. And it really doesn't matter what technology you use. The decision model presents the business logic totally independent of technology. But even more important, the decision model puts the decision itself at the center of business leaders, and it serves as the basis by which they can come up with better decision-making criteria and for reacting to changing business environments. So before we present the decision model, let me first define what we mean by a business decision. So this page defines a business decision as a conclusion that the business arrives at through business logic, and which the conclusion is something that the business is interested in managing or managing better. So on this table, we have 2 headers. The first column is fact type, and the second column is business decision. Under the column for business decision are examples of business decisions from different industries. For example, there's one there that's called Determine Insurance Policy Renewal Method. This is the decision that decides whether it is acceptable for an insurance policy to be automatically renewed by a system or if it needs to be reviewed by a human underwriter. So the decision model recognizes that a business decision